My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 59 and I live in Cleveland, Ohio. My wife's name is Natalie Walker. She's 38. The relic she stole belonged to my father, a faded bronze medallion with his name engraved on the back, Private J. Walker, 1944. It sat under my pillow for 30 years, a weight that meant more than metal, and when it disappeared, I realized what she'd taken wasn't only a trinket, but the last piece of a life I thought unbroken. The morning I found the empty velvet case, I didn't panic. I cataloged. The drawer was disturbed in a way someone inexperienced would make. A scuff hidden under the felt, a thread pulled where a finger had been clumsy. I opened the safe just to be certain. Empty. The metal was gone. I moved through the house like a man taking inventory after lightning. The porch light, the set of keys, the crumbs on the stairs, until habit led me to places she hid things. There was no jewel box in the usual places, no trace of a new sale. I called Natalie into the kitchen. She looked up from her coffee, hair pulled back, the sort of casual calm practiced by people who assume time will always bend around them. "Where's Dad's medal?" I asked, watching her face. She blinked. "What are you talking about? He gave that to you years ago." "It's gone," I said. "I can't find it." Her fingers tightened around the mug. For a second, a shadow passed across her face, and she said, "Maybe you moved it." That wasn't a denial. That was a rehearsal of one. I slid a photograph across the table, a grainy close-up of the back, where the stamp and the little dent by the edge were recognizable. "This one," I said. "It's missing." She swallowed, then said, "Ethan, if you suspect me, don't finish that. Tell me where it is." She looked at me like a woman calculating the thermal path of a lie. "I don't know. Ask Dennis." The name landed like a stone. Not my son, but a man she worked with, young, with a penchant for collectibles and expensive tastes. Panic didn't arrive. A different thing arrived. A resolution like steel folding into a blade. I spent the next day in a rhythm I hadn't known I still had. I called the estate where Dad had served. They confirmed the engraving history. I called the one auction house in town with military pieces and asked if they had acquired anything matching a private's medallion. The clerk laughed politely and said, "We don't deal in family curios, sir." He lied. Later, when I scrolled through a collector forum, I found a post by a user called Victor LaRue showing photographs of a medallion, the same faint dent, the same worn strap impression, and in the corner of the photo, someone had captured the seller's slip, a cropped image, but enough. A line on the receipt read, "N. Walker, consignment." A second photograph showed the piece mounted under glass at Victor's private display captioned casually, "Recent acquisition, provenance claimed by seller." I printed everything, photographs, screenshots, the cropped receipt, and carried them back into the kitchen at midnight while she slept. I could have waited for confrontation and melodrama. Instead, I sat with the evidence like flat timber, measuring where the cut should go. The logic was simple. Recover the medallion, expose the lie, and make the betrayal visible in daylight. I wanted the collector humiliated, the transaction undone, the levered identified. I wanted Natalie to understand the cost of removing a man's history for the price of a weekend. I rehearsed a question in my head to throw at her that would shatter the careful script she'd already learned. Who is Victor LaRue? When I finally asked, she didn't look surprised. She looked startled, because whatever she thought she'd hidden had the smell of complacency. "He's just a guy from work," she said, voice flat. "He collects things." "You sold him my father's medal." I didn't raise my voice. I wanted each word to sit in the air like truth. She closed her eyes for a breath and said, "It wasn't selling, it was—" "What?" I pressed. Her answer was small and animal. "I needed cash. For us." For us. The old, familiar lie disguised as sacrifice. Her hand reached for mine. I kept it away. "You gave a man's memory for a weekend." She opened her mouth and then shut it. She had been sleeping with his receipts, his messages, the small confirmations that keep affairs tidy. I had the thread now. I could have gone to the police, filed a forgery report, demanded restitution. I could have called the auction and screamed until a manager gave me a name. I did none of those things that night. Instead, I started making a list of people who would care about what she had done. Veterans groups, my father's old regiment, the local paper that loved a human interest story about lost things found. I wanted the medallion returned without a fight, but I wanted the extraction to sting. The next step would be to get inside Victor's circle. The next step would be to pry the truth out in a public room where excuses have no refuge. Before bed, I left the printed receipt on the kitchen table where she would see it in the morning and wrote nothing because words matter less than the silence they force. I slept with the image of the engraving in my head, the small letters on the back of a metal disc, a name, a date, a life.
I don't work by shouting. I work by setting pressure where it hurts. And pressure is a slow thing that needs patience. And patience smells like planning. I spent the next morning mapping Victor LaRue, social media breadcrumbs, a LinkedIn profile that bristled with the kind of petty prestige collectors crave, a private gallery with a membership roster that read like a small city's playbook of ego. I traced the consignment back through an online portal and found the intermediary, an account registered to a storage unit on the east side, an email with Victor's initials. The more I dug, the more comfortable his world looked. Comfortable people make sloppy mistakes because comfort breeds assumption. I called him, pretending to be a distant relative interested in military memorabilia, and he was eager, expansive, greedy for respect. "You can't just call me about provenance and hang up," he said, amusement thick in his voice. "If you're serious, come by the gallery. We have a tasting on Saturday." I said yes before I had a plan because saying yes gave me a place where I could watch him perform possession. Over the next 48 hours, I arranged everything with the deliberate slowness of a man who knows he is building a noose, not out of spite alone, but out of the cold calculus of teaching a lesson that would sit in daylight. I started by contacting the Veterans Association where my father had been a member. I played the script of an elder man missing a relic and asked if they had ever seen it at local exhibits. They were helpful, offended, almost on instinct, and promised to keep an eye out. That small act of legitimacy made my later moves surgical. I rented a plain suit I had not worn since my funeral years in imagination, practiced the smile that doesn't invite explanation, and rehearsed 2 stories, one for Victor, one for Natalie, each calibrated to coax reaction without letting emotion leak. Saturday arrived, and Victor's gallery smelled of lemon cleaner and expensive fear. People clustered in small islands of pretense, champagne glasses catching the overhead light, while his pieces glinted under soft lamps like animals in a zoo. I moved through the room like a man inspecting trophies, slow and casual, until I found the case. The medallion mounted on a dark velvet back, its dent and stamp visible like a signature I had never wanted to see outside a pocket next to my heart. Victor stood nearby as if he'd been born into possession. I introduced myself as Percival J. Walker's grandson in the worst possible lie. No one in the room corrected me because social events are shy on facts and hungry for drama. Victor loved it. Vanity is fuel to men who collect other people's bravery. I let him talk, let him describe provenance, the charm of the find, the thrill of acquisition, while I leaned closer and asked the single question that would unmask the whole charade. "Who consigned this to you?" He named Natalie with a chuckle, the word a stumbling stone he didn't think to hide. The room shifted. I saw the instant that ownership loses its gloss. I slid a business card across the glass and said quietly, "I'm going to take a closer look." He smiled, too sure of himself, and handed me the case. Fingerprints ghosted the edge of the mount, small, neat prints that matched the ones I'd photographed on the receipt. I could have called the cops then, but police make the process public in ways that flatten the more satisfying private lesson. Instead, I told Victor I wanted to buy it and asked him to hold it under his counter while we negotiated. He agreed, delighted, and left the case in a small locked drawer. Later, alone in the gallery office, I used the contact information I had for the storage unit and called as Natalie in a voice pitched to sound embarrassed and flustered. "Hi, it's Natalie. I'm worried. Someone's been making inquiries about my consignment. I need assurance my information stays confidential." The clerk reassured her and promised discretion. They would not release details to third parties. My confession in her voice was a quiet film. I was ceding permission for breach. The next move was surgical. I contacted a journalist I knew from the city paper and framed the story simply. Family relic sold without family consent. Private collector profiting from wartime memory. I didn't exaggerate. I handed the reporter every scanned receipt and the photograph of the cropped consignment slip that bore Natalie Walker's name. She smelled a story like a hound smells blood. Her call the following morning promised coverage, but I asked her to hold until after I delivered a private ultimatum. Then I sent Victor a single email replicating the tone of the reporter. We're writing about unethical acquisitions of wartime memorabilia. Please confirm your consignment paperwork and source provenance before Saturday evening's feature. The email was carefully anonymous, but professional, enough to unsettle him. That night, Victor called me from his private number, frantic, voice high, his showman's confidence thinning. "You can't let that run. It will ruin me." I said nothing. Silence is a noise people fill with their own guilt. Meanwhile, back at home, I had to maintain the theater of domestic life while my internal machinery hummed like a hidden engine. Natalie noticed my late nights and tried to charm me with small gestures, lattes, a new plant, casual intimacy that tasted like an attempt at grease. I let her think she could soften me. Softening was part of the trap. On Friday, I left a handwritten note under her pillow in a tight, cruel script. "If it's truly for us, prove it. Meet me at the gallery, 6 p.m. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. She came, practical, nails manicured, purse clipped to her elbow like a shield. When she walked in and saw me standing there, she understood the room had become a stage. Her eyes darted to the case that held the medallion and narrowed. "Percy, what are you doing here?" I smiled, gentle, incomplete. Reclaiming history. That was the moment she realized the play she had written had become a courtroom without a judge, and I had the authority nobody had expected me to hold.
When Natalie's voice cracked in that gallery, something inside me hardened into steel. Not rage, not grief, but a stillness that made my words sharp and cold. She tried to lower her tone, aware that a few heads were turning, but the look in my eyes must have warned her that whispers weren't enough to save her. "You don't understand," she muttered, her face pale. Victor offered. I cut her short with a calm hand raised, my voice controlled as if reading from a script. "Don't insult me with explanations. You sold my father's medal. You didn't just betray me, you erased him." The air between us was a wire pulled tight. Victor fidgeted, desperate to turn this into a misunderstanding. "Percy, let's be reasonable. Your wife, well, she thought." I pivoted, pinning him with the same cold glare. "She is not my wife here. She is a thief, and you are her buyer. There's nothing reasonable about stealing memory and pawning it for champagne." The gallery had hushed. A crowd had gathered, hungry for spectacle, eyes glinting with curiosity that carried no sympathy. Natalie shifted, whispering harshly, "You're humiliating me." I leaned in, just close enough for her to feel the words like glass. "No, Natalie, I'm exposing you. Humiliation is what you did to yourself." I turned deliberately to the onlookers and raised my voice just enough. "This medal belongs to Sergeant William Walker, my father. It was stolen from my home and sold without my knowledge. I came here tonight because it matters more than any profit. And now you all know how it found its way to this case." Murmurs rippled through the room. Eyes flicked to Victor, then to Natalie, judgment passing faster than fire. Victor's face strained, reputation burning under the scrutiny. He stammered something about paperwork, about legitimacy, but the damage was already done. In that silence, Natalie's facade collapsed. Her lips trembled, but no apology came, only the raw ugliness of exposure. I reached for the case, lifted it from the drawer with measured movements, and pressed my thumb against the cool glass. "This doesn't belong to you, or you," I said, looking between them, "and it never will. It belongs to my blood, my history, and it's coming home." I walked out without waiting for permission, metal secured in its mount, leaving them to choke on their ruined poise. Outside, the night air tasted sharp, a clean contrast to the suffocating rot inside that gallery. My phone buzzed almost instantly. Natalie. I let it ring, then another, each vibration a pathetic echo of desperation. Finally, I answered. Her voice broke through, ragged and defensive. "Percy, please, we need to talk. It wasn't what it looked like." I kept my tone steady, colder than I felt. "It looked like you sold your husband's soul to feed a stranger's ego, and that's exactly what it was." She tried to soften, switching tactics. I made a mistake. We can fix this. Please don't ruin me. I laughed, not cruelly, but with the weary amusement of a man who sees truth stripped bare. Ruin you? Natalie, you did that yourself. I'm just making sure everyone sees the ruins. Then I hung up. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the metal in front of me, tracing the dent with my thumb, thinking of my father's hands, his silence, his sacrifices. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt connected to him again. But connection wasn't enough. Revenge had to be finished properly. The journalist was waiting. She had the receipts, the proof, the names. In her draft headline, I read my life in stark letters. Collector buys stolen valor, local woman named in scandal. I told her to hold just one more day. Saturday morning, Natalie walked into the kitchen, face hollow, makeup smeared by a sleepless night. She reached for the metal like a moth desperate for flame, but I pulled it back. You lost this the moment you signed it away. Her jaw clenched. If you go public, you'll destroy me. I leaned forward, eyes steady, voice almost gentle. No, Natalie, you destroyed yourself. I'm just handing you the mirror. She froze, unable to speak, and I realized then that the true punishment wasn't the loss of reputation, not even the whispers of the crowd. It was her knowing she would never again control the narrative. That night, I pressed send, and the story spread like oil on fire.
I didn't confront them right away. Anger would have been satisfying for a few minutes, but it would not give me back what mattered. My father's medal wasn't just a piece of metal to hang on a wall. It was the only thing that kept him close to me after he was buried, and I wasn't about to let a cheap affair bury him twice. I started with the collector. His name was Ivan, a smug man who worked through private channels, always careful, always discreet. Men like him hate exposure more than anything, and I knew I could use that. I called him posing as a potential seller, told him I had access to several rare items from an old estate, things that would interest someone of his taste. His voice over the phone shifted from caution to greed. He wanted details, pictures, a meeting. I strung him along with promises, slowly gaining his trust until he started bragging about what he already had, like predators do when they think they've found another wolf. That's how I confirmed he had my father's medal, displayed in his gallery but not yet public. I asked him to send me a discreet picture to prove his seriousness. He sent it. My heart stopped for a second when I saw it. The scratches, the ribbon, the dent on the edge. It was the same one I had held countless times. The same one my father had pressed into my hand before telling me I was the only one who should ever own it. I saved that picture. Multiple copies, hidden in places he couldn't touch. Now came the harder part. My woman, Lena, had no idea I knew the full extent. She thought she'd played it well, that her lies covered her tracks. One evening at dinner, I asked her how her day was, as if nothing in me had shifted, and she gave me that tired smile she always used when she wanted to avoid real conversation. I studied her face, every twitch, every glance at her phone. She was waiting for him to text, I knew it. Instead of exploding, I told her I was thinking of refinancing the house, pretending I needed her signature again, just to see her reaction. She stiffened for a split second, then brushed it off, saying she was too tired to talk about finances. That one moment was enough. She knew she had tangled herself in something bigger, and now she was scared I might find it. Good. Fear was what I wanted. While she slept, I dug deeper into bank statements, emails, little traces she forgot to erase. The debts she had signed weren't just numbers. They were chains meant for me, all tied to my name. But greed makes people sloppy. She had left a trail linking Ivan to her. Transfers, small at first, then larger. Payments labeled as consulting, but in reality her way of funneling money to his collection. I gathered everything, building a case, not for police yet, but for leverage. I visited a lawyer under the guise of simple advice. I asked about asset transfers, about what happens when a spouse forges signatures. The lawyer's eyes narrowed when I mentioned it, told me it was a serious crime. I smiled politely, thanked him, and walked out. It wasn't the law I was after, not yet. The law takes time, and I wanted precision. I wanted them both cornered. I arranged another call with Ivan. This time I hinted that one of the pieces I had access to was questionable in origin, something that might attract attention if shown. His tone shifted immediately.
He told me to be careful, that collectors like him needed clean items. That was my opening. I casually mentioned that someone had tried to sell me a medal recently, one with military engraving, but I wasn't sure if it was real. Silence. Then he asked me to describe it. I gave him vague details, just enough for him to sweat, but not enough for him to know how much I knew. His voice cracked slightly, and that was all I needed. By the time I ended the call, I had a clear plan. I was going to take back what was mine, not by begging, not by threats, but by making them destroy themselves. All I had to do was keep smiling at Lena, keep stringing Ivan along, until the moment came when both would collapse under the weight of their own lies. And when that moment came, I would be there to watch. The trap needed two things: an authority who couldn't be ignored, and a moment that would force them to show their faces. So I spent a week sewing those threads together. I called Dr. Alvarez, a military historian whose name carried weight in the veterans circles, and I lied well enough to get her interest. I told her I had a suspected fake and asked if she would appraise it privately. She agreed to come to the gallery under the pretense of an upcoming lecture, which put a legitimate scholar in a place full of petty vanity. That was the authority. Then I called the reporter again, not to run a story, but to arrange cameras for the gallery on the day Dr. Alvarez toured, framing it as coverage of a cultural event. The point wasn't to ambush them with words, but to bring light where they preferred shadow. Meanwhile, I continued feeding Ivan just enough bait: photos of other items coming from the same estate, promises of more consignments, flattery tailored to his ego so he would behave normally while I organized the theater. On the morning of the appraisal, I walked into Victor's display room wearing my plain coat and a face that showed nothing but polite interest. Natalie arrived late, breathless, palms damp, clutching a small purse that trembled in ways bad liars do. She met my eyes, and for a flicker, something like fear passed through her features. Then she pasted on an expression of bored annoyance, as if anything could be smoothed with charm. Victor welcomed Dr. Alvarez with the practiced grin of men who think provenance can be created with a story and a certificate. The historian took the medallion from its case with gloves, turned it over, read the engraving aloud as if reciting a verdict: Private J. Walker, 1944. She paused, lifted her reading glasses, and said, "This mark matches an original issuance from the 1940s, but these notes on the back, someone has attempted to restrap it, and the patina is inconsistent with items that remained in family custody." Her tone was clinical, but the implication was a hammer. At that, the gallery leaned forward. Collectors taste scandal the way vultures taste wind. I watched Ivan shift, watched the color go from his face as his hands brushed the case. He tried to laugh it off. Provenance was provided, paperwork was in order, he said. But his voice had an edge that betrayed panic. The reporter, who had been polite and patient, now stood and said into a small recorder, "Dr. Alvarez suspects this medal may have been removed from private family possession and sold without consent." The words spread faster than smoke. I let that moment breathe, then stepped into it. "It was removed from my house while I was asleep," I said evenly. "My wife consigned it. My name is Percival Walker. I can prove the ownership and I can prove the sale." Natalie made a sound like a small animal caught. Then she moved, a quick little step toward the case, as if to snatch it back by force of will. "Percy, please," she whispered, "not here." Victor blocked her with a hand, angry and frightened. "You can't just," he started. I held up my palm and asked the reporter to record the exchange. He did, because journalists live for the exact crack of truth that turns a room. For reasons they'd later try to describe as morality or haste, the Veterans Association representative who had come with Dr. Alvarez now asked for documentation. And Victor could not produce a clear chain of custody. The cropped receipt was not enough when a live historian and a paper trail stood in the same room. Panic turned Natalie from sly to frantic. She bolted toward a back room where Victor kept a locked drawer, and in that instant I moved with the quiet speed of someone who's lived long enough to know how to act when others act badly. I reached the drawer before she did and found the medallion under a folded napkin, as if hiding it had been a thought done in hurried guilt. Her hand closed on my wrist like a vice. "Give it back," she hissed. I didn't answer. I lifted the piece like a man holding a small, stubborn son and let Dr. Alvarez confirm, with a satisfied, almost tender nod, that this was indeed the medallion whose name had been carved into our life. The room hummed with the noise of consequences. The reporter's camera clicked. Victor's phone lit with messages. In the chaos, Natalie tried to spin. "It was consigned legally," she cried, but her voice was thin against the weight of the historian's opinion and the visible evidence of sale. The gallery manager, suddenly imagining legal headaches and the risk of losing members, asked Victor to step outside while they consulted counsel. He left like a man who knows the rug under him is being pulled. I turned to Natalie then and said, quiet and precise, "You knew you couldn't ask me, so you took. You chose a man who buys valor for trophies. Now you will live with what you chose." She reached for excuses that sounded like pleadings and fake sorrow. "We needed money," she said. And then the veteran's representative spoke with a voice that had the calm of someone used to grieving and to being angry on behalf of others. "If items of service are sold without family consent, we pursue recovery. We have resources. We will assist in reclaiming this, and if necessary, will involve the authorities." That name, the authorities, fell on Victor like rain, but it fell on Natalie too, heavier. I didn't shout. I watched as her composure unraveled on the gallery floor, as the man she had sold to huddled in the doorway and begged for patience. I watched the cameras capture the small collapse of her face, a slow fall from the comfortable ledge she'd stood on. Afterwards, while Victor argued and the veterans made calls, I walked outside with the medallion in my pocket and called the person who mattered the most, my brother. I told him what had happened, and he said nothing for a long time, then asked simply, "Do you want it back in the family museum?" I answered yes. The medallion's metal felt colder in my palm when I thought of the lie Natalie had wrapped it in. I left the gallery with everything recorded: the historian's notes, the reporter's audio, Victor's protests, Natalie's admissions muffled but present. I could have sent police in then. I could have demanded immediate arrest, but I had not wanted them caged. I wanted their reputations shredded in the exact rooms where they once preened. I wanted the slow fall. The first legal letters went out the next morning, letters attached to the reporter's piece, letters sent by the Veterans Association demanding provenance, letters hinting at civil action if restitution weren't immediate. By noon, Victor's private clients were calling. By evening, his exhibitions were quieter. By nightfall, Natalie's phone rang until it went silent. She texted me, hate and pleading braided into one line. "Please don't do this. It's over." I replied with a fact, not with mercy. It's not over until you understand what you took. The medallion was back in my possession, but the lesson had only started its slow work. The final act wasn't dramatic in the way I had pictured when rage first sharpened into purpose. It was quieter, bureaucratic, the kind of slow ruin that tastes like iron and makes no sound until the world notices the absence. After the gallery fallout, letters multiplied. Formal demands from the Veterans Association, a polite but firm request from the reporter for a follow-up interview, and email threads where collectors I had never met asked for clarification about provenance. Victor's contacts thinned. 2 of his regular clients quietly rescinded memberships to his private viewing room. One major donor asked for full restitution, or he'd publicize the names of everyone who had bought items from Victor in the last year. The pressure came from where status lives, and men like Victor fold sooner to risk than to law. Natalie's calls shifted from pleading to bargaining to rage, then to silence. She appeared at the house one afternoon outside visiting hours, hair pinned cheap and eyes rimmed red. "Percy," she said, breathless, words clumsy with apology. "Listen to me. I'll make it right. I can sell my things. Pay it back." I put the medallion on the kitchen table between us, the bronze catching the light in the way it always had, humble and exact. "This isn't about money," I said. "It's about what you traded for it. Money would not stitch what you cut." She faltered. And then, in a voice that tried for contrition but kept finding excuses, she said, "You never understood. He said he'd help. He said things would change." I listened because I wanted to see where the lie lived in her throat. "You chose him," I said. "You chose the man who will collect trophies and forget faces." She reached as if to snatch the medallion, and I pulled it back like a reflex. "You took my father's name and sold it for someone else's applause." Her lips pressed together. "Please," she whispered, "don't make this worse." I considered calling the police and pressing charges. I considered a full public shaming that would burn every bridge she had left. Instead, I made choices that were surgical and final. I involved counsel to ensure restitution and documented apologies for the association records. But most importantly, I severed the thread she had relied on. I moved out, not to spite, but to demonstrate consequence. I placed our names on a separation petition with terms that transferred custody of the house and its memory back into a space where it would be protected, not pawned. I signed documents that would mean she'd have to account for every sale, every cent. The legal system is a lamp. It lights dark things in ways gossip cannot. Victor's gallery suspended operations pending audit. His private clients demanded proof for refunds, and one by one they walked. The man who had once paraded other people's valor now found himself dining alone in rooms that used to be full of applause. He called me once, voice tight with disbelief and a man's sudden fear. "We can fix this," he pleaded. "We can do private compensation." I told him no. "You don't get to buy reputation back with cash you earned off other people's lives," I said. "You've already made your profit from a theft. Let the record show it." He hung up. The Veterans Association arranged a small ceremony in the town hall where the medallion was authenticated and accepted into their care. They offered me a place of honor on the preservation committee, which I declined, instead requesting a modest plaque that noted the provenance and the return. I wanted the medal story told plainly, not gilded with speeches. The reporter printed the follow-up, a sober account of theft, complicity, and restitution. It reached farther than I expected. Messages came from men who had lost things in similar ways, and letters from younger veterans who thanked me for not letting the object become a prop for someone's vanity. Natalie's company issued a statement the week after the article, an internal investigation into conduct, an HR meeting, and, eventually, resignation under pressure. Friends who had once smiled in our living room stopped returning calls. I don't revel in the collapse of a life. I catalog it because it is evidence that what we teach another by our patience can become their rope. In the quiet that followed, the house felt like a place of recovered objects rather than trophies. I boxed a small number of items, photographs, my father's letters, the old pocket watch, and took them to the Veterans Archive with instructions that these things remain accessible to family, not for sale. The medallion I left in their custody for safekeeping. Sometimes I visit and stand before its case and feel closer to a man I loved in ways we never articulate. My son called once, tentative. One line of apology fuzzed and weak. He didn't ask about forgiveness. He asked practical questions about the future. I answered briefly, with no promise to rescue. People ask me if I feel lighter now that the storm has passed. The truth is complicated. The emptiness where trust used to live is a new weight, but it is honest weight. I sleep differently. I eat without the expected interruption of a crisis call. I walk the same streets and feel less like a man available for other people's emergencies. There is a kind of satisfaction in that, but it is not clean ecstasy. It is the quiet knowledge that when someone removes a place in your life that is sacred, you are allowed to replace it with boundaries. Revenge for me was never about spectacle. It was the calibration of consequence so that a lesson would lodge where excuses had lived. When I meet my neighbor now, we exchange nods that carry the history of the block. Common decency, small favors, the fact that people who act like family have to be tested by truth. Natalie's name appears in search results, but the entries are factual and dry. That is a mercy of a sort. Victor eventually reopened under a different name, with fewer clients, and a staff that knew how to ask for provenance. He sent a letter of regret that read like an admission without malice. I kept the letter in a drawer for a few years, then shredded it. It felt inadequate to hold any more of his excuses. The medallion rests now behind glass under the watchful care of people who value it for what it represents, rather than for the buy and sell of collectors. When I stand before it, I think of my father's hands, the quiet life he led, the stories he told without complaint. I think of how easily some people treat history as currency, and of how necessary it is for those of us left behind to speak up. I do not crave reconciliation with Natalie. There are doors closed because of what she chose, and doors open that were once hidden behind placation. I learned a lesson I wished I'd taught earlier. Rescue that becomes habit breeds dependency, and dependency is the seedbed of betrayal. I could have forgiven and pretended and fed the pattern, but I chose to end it. That decision cost me a marriage, but gave me something steadier in its place: self-respect and space for what remains to be mine. If people call that revenge, it is a tidy, honest sort, measured, public, irrevocable. If it is a lesson, then let it stand where the metal stands, visible, labeled, and impossible to sell again.